I was born in Toccoa, which is also a Cherokee word for the beautiful. It's a small town, so you see everybody, especially from middle school through high school, almost every day.
Sean Scott grows up as a devout Southern Baptist in the small town in Georgia where his parents meet in 1973.
My mom got pregnant, and they got married out of a sense of obligation to their Christian faith. They got divorced, and my mom met Don the next summer. The gentleman that I call my dad, Don Scott, adopted me in 1981. And I always felt like he dearly loved me. Dad never made me feel any different from the rest of the Scott family.
Don marries Sean's mother, and 8 years later, Sean's half-brother Daniel is born.
When I was very little, Sean and I were very close. He was my childhood hero. Sean was this rock star. Everyone knew who he was, everyone liked him, everyone was always wanting to talk to him. He was on the football team. That was the #1 football team in the state for many years. I wanted to do nothing more than to be Sean.
As he nears his junior year, Sean starts thinking about his future. He has huge aspirations for college, but his mom is an artist, and his stepdad is retired from the Navy.
And both my mom and dad sat me down and said, look, son, we're concerned that if you're going to go to college, you're going to have to figure out how to finance it yourself because we don't have the means to help you. So I started looking for all the schools that had cheap tuition, and then I landed on the United States Military Academy at West Point, and tuition per semester was $0. I'm like, wow, that's going to be easy to afford.
But West Point is the most prestigious military academy in the country and extremely difficult to get into.
So I spent a lot of time from 10th grade on in the guidance counselor's office. That's how I came into Trish Ellis's circle of awareness.
Trish Ellis, a bookkeeper at the school inside the guidance department, is the wife of a prominent pharmacist in town and the mother of Wendy Ellis.
Wendy was very outgoing and friendly, smiling all the time. She was a cheerleader.
I do remember Trish Ellis, Wendy's mother, being very, very much supportive of Sean. I believe that she saw that that would be very promising for her daughter.
Trish stops me one day and says, hey, Sean, Wendy is struggling in algebra. Do you mind tutoring her? And we'll be happy to pay you. I'm like, I'll do that for free. I'll pay you to do that. Wendy pretended to be struggling to learn and not be able to understand. She would bat her eyes at me, which really excited me. I was just mesmerized by the radiant blue eyes that she had. I really enjoyed the interaction with Wendy.
During the last semester of his senior year, Sean notices that Wendy is absent from school.
I passed Trish's office and I said, hey, Trish, I haven't seen Wendy in school in like 2 weeks. Is she all right? And she says, oh, well, it's pretty sad, but she's in the hospital down near Atlanta for a eating disorder, bulimia and anorexia.
Sean decides to show support for Wendy and visits her.
When I came in, she looked pitiful. When she saw me, she just lit up. Her eyes got wide. She's like, Sean, you came to see me. And that just got me right there. It's probably the initial seed that made me ask her to go with me to our senior prom.
Sean is delighted when Wendy recovers and agrees to go to the prom with him.
The night before my prom, I got home and there was all this paperwork laid out. There's a set of orders with my name on it, and there's instructions to coordinate travel to West Point. I was so relieved. The next afternoon, I picked up Wendy. We took pictures, and then we were off to dinner and then to the high school gymnasium.
The news of Sean's acceptance into West Point spreads throughout the dance.
Herb and Trish Ellis were chaperones, and they looked like they were overjoyed. Wendy said, "Oh, everyone is so proud of you, and I love you so much." You know, that night, I probably said I love you so that she would kiss me again.
Sean and Wendy grow closer, but once he's at West Point for his freshman year, Sean's schedule is regimented from sunup to sundown.
We were busy. Every time we went to the payphones for the privilege of a very brief phone call, my number one priority was to call Wendy. My second priority was to call my parents.
Wendy tells Sean she is still struggling with her eating disorder, but being in New York makes it hard for him to help her back home in Georgia.
When I was home on leave, Wendy asked me if I would go to one of her psych appointments. I was wholly and consciously aware that Wendy had long-term mental health challenges.
I believe that the protective nature of Sean would draw him to try to help someone like her. She's beautiful, she's well-known, the family's well-known. She has a problem, so naturally a protective person like that would want to try to shelter that person and help fix them.
At West Point, the years in the calendar seem to fly by, but every day seems like it's an eternity. So in order to help make the experience tolerable, there are a series of milestone events that include a speech, a ball, a dinner, and one of those is called 500th Night.
The event takes place during Sean's junior year, and Wendy's parents drive her from Georgia to New York to celebrate.
They allowed Wendy and I to have some private time alone. Wendy and I enjoyed a wonderful night, and I was really excited and proud to show off my girlfriend from my hometown. It was just like a night of joy and excitement.
With only one more year till Sean's graduation, the future looks bright if they can get a handle on Wendy's health issues.
One day, we were out shopping together, and she just fainted right there in the store. She refused to have an ambulance called. She said that she had diabetes. I had no clue she had diabetes.
Wendy Scott is a very manipulative woman, and she's very dangerous.
She craved attention and affection from others, and she went to any length to get that.
Now I don't know what to believe.
Sean Scott is at West Point when he finds out that his girlfriend Wendy has another serious health complaint.
When I found out that Wendy had diabetes, I was very concerned for her health. She told me that the insulin that she had, she did not get from a doctor. Her father got it from his pharmacy that he worked at and gave it to her. Only once did I actually see her inject herself with insulin. I loved her, and I wanted to be a support to her and to help her in any way that I can.
Sean seemed happy with Wendy, but there was always something. about her that made me feel uncomfortable. There was just always that little feeling in me that just made me feel unsure about her.
By Sean's third year at West Point, his relationship with Wendy has evolved. However, he suffers a devastating loss in his family in April 1996 when his stepdad becomes seriously ill.
I made it home on emergency leave from West Point just in time.
I remember Sean opening the door to the ICU in his uniform from West Point and running through the ICU to my father's side. And then I was taken out of the room, but I remember looking back and seeing Sean sitting there holding his hand.
I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. And I held on to it until I felt the warmth leave.
The next year, Sean's stepdad's absence is felt at his graduation from West Point. But Sean is able to celebrate with Wendy and family.
My mom, my brother, Herb, Trish, Wendy's grandparents came and attended. I was full of pride and exuberance. I had people in my hometown that were there. I was going to get to shake hands with the President of the United States. It was just a great day all around.
A few days later, Sean and Wendy drive from New York to Georgia to elope without family present.
Wendy and I got married in a tiny little chapel on June 3rd, 1997. My best friend Joe was my best man, and he brought along his wife. Wendy was over the top. She acted as if she was about to faint. She did not focus on me. She had a hard time getting through her vows. So that part was kind of bizarre. We had made plans for a honeymoon, and we drove straight through the night to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Wendy was not interested in any physical intimacy, and she said that she was feeling physically ill, and that was a great disappointment. But to me, that was not as important as abiding by my vow to love, cherish, and care for her in sickness and in health. I was okay with that because there are higher priorities than my own carnal satisfaction.
A year later, in 1998, after taking the U.S. Army Engineer Officers course, Wendy and Sean moved to Columbia, Georgia, just a few hours from home.
My first permanent duty station in the Army was Fort Benning in Georgia. And we went and did fun things by ourselves and with other people, my West Point classmates included.
Later that year, Hurricane Mitch devastates Central America, and Sean is deployed as part of the Army Corps of Engineers. When Sean returns to Fort Benning, he finds Wendy in a health crisis.
Wendy had gotten a referral to an oncologist because there were some irregularities in her blood work. She told me, "Oh my God, Sean, what if I have cancer?" And then the oncologist broke the news to me that he felt, in his professional opinion, Wendy had leukemia. I couldn't believe it. It was just another shock. I never shaved my own head, but I helped her shave hers. I rarely cried. I definitely cried tears that dripped on her head while I was helping her shave it. She was so grateful, and we had intimate contact that we hadn't had in months or maybe even in years at that point.
Wendy tells Sean that she wants to do the treatments on her own so as not to distract him from his work.
She said, "I've found a specialist that can treat me right here at the hospital. You can just drop me off in the morning, and then I'll find a ride home." While she was going to chemotherapy, there was less strange behavior, and all the other antics faded away.
Wendy starts her treatment, and Sean believes that all is going well until one day he is summoned to a meeting with some other Army spouses at Fort Benning.
It was a historic home of a colonel, and Wendy was sitting there, and she looked up at me, had a very nervous look on her face, and was very fidgety. You could hear a pin drop. One of the spouses said, "We have discovered that Wendy does not really have cancer. She's been lying to us, and we've all been deeply hurt by this." I couldn't say anything. I was filled with rage.
Second Lieutenant Sean Scott has been told by a group of Army spouses that his wife Wendy is faking having cancer.
I was just devastated, embarrassed. I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't say anything except thank you for bringing this to my attention. I am so sorry that this happened. I learned that one of the church community saw her at the hospital. She just walked around like a normal person, and she wasn't behaving like she would behave at church, where she would present as if she was deathly ill and unable to perform activities of daily living on her own and needed help.
But how did Wendy trick her oncologist into a leukemia diagnosis?
I was finally coming to grips with an escalating pattern of behavior. I believe Wendy figured out how to manipulate her body so that her blood work came back such that more than one medical provider was convinced that she had leukemia.
He had worked very hard to get to where he was, and he had a very promising career ahead of him. The situation that she put them in could very much damage his entire career.
I was committed to her because I considered marriage my bond with Wendy and with God. And I wasn't going to give up on that, and I was determined not to get a divorce. I decided that I was going to monitor and control her behavior as best I could.
For the next 2 years, Sean focuses on the demands of his career and spends less and less time with Wendy. In April of 2002, he is notified that Wendy is in the ER because of a complication related to her diabetes.
The physician on call was present. After the whole cancer thing, I knew from then on that she was faking. She found some new docs who didn't know her backstory. I said, "Look, doc, I respect what you do, and I just want you to know that I know without a shadow of a doubt that my wife does not have diabetes. Never has." He paused, looked at me in the eyes for a second and said, "Okay, would you like for me to put her on a 72-hour hold?" I came in and told her she was going to a psych ward, and she was livid. She was throwing objects at me. She was yelling at me.
And Wendy has one more bomb to drop.
A nurse came in and said, "We got your blood results." Wendy was pregnant.
On December 13th, 2002, Sean and Wendy's daughter is born with hydrocephalus, a condition that will require multiple surgeries.
When our daughter was born, Wendy's behaviors regarding her own health just disappeared. It was like magic. I found out that I was deploying. I was amped and energized and excited to exercise my leadership in the role of company commander.
Sean is deployed to Kuwait, but gets emergency medical leave to return to the U.S. in March 2004.
I was back in the States in Chapel Hill, North Carolina for the first of a series of brain surgeries for our daughter at a UNC medical center. My personal belief is that the hydrocephalus condition, which was diagnosed as Chiari malformation, was congenital. In 2004, my daughter began developing symptoms from vomiting to abnormal eating behavior to constant diarrhea.
Sean is now stationed at Fort Detrick, Maryland, so that the family can be close to Walter Reed Medical Center, where their daughter is a frequent visitor.
The doctors were unsure as to what exactly was wrong. They were pursuing the option of leukemia, and they were doing everything that they could to help her.
Over the next 3 years, Sean and Wendy pull closer together. Wendy is no longer faking health issues and gives birth to a son who is underweight but otherwise healthy. At Walter Reed, the doctors cannot determine the cause of Sean's daughter's ongoing symptoms.
My daughter underwent hundreds of diagnostic procedures. The spinal tap, that's an extremely painful procedure, and it was gut-wrenching, heartbreaking to be present and in the room with her.
In June of 2007, Sean gets a call from Wendy.
There's going to be a multidisciplinary team meeting. So all the specialists, along with the primary care manager, meet in a room with the parents, and one of the lead GI physicians laid a bombshell. There are levels of magnesium in your daughter's system that I cannot account for. So that tells me that either you pointing at me or you pointing at Wendy or both of you have been giving your daughter magnesium of some form. And Wendy confessed on the spot. I did it, and I looked at her in front of all these people. All I could say was, how could you?
The place that you have to be mentally to do something like that to an innocent little child, you would have to be evil.
Sean Scott's 4-year-old daughter has undergone dozens of medical procedures for various health issues since her birth. His wife, Wendy, has now admitted to poisoning her. The state takes custody of the Scott children.
Anger doesn't even come close. It's more like rage. I was shocked, stunned, sickened, saddened. I drove Wendy home, and she cried, and she blabbered on to me about how we still have to stick together as a family. And I just looked at her, and I was like, will you shut the or I was going to wreck the car and kill both of us.
In June 2007, I received a call from Fort Detrick advising me that they had just received a call from Walter Reed and they believed they had a child abuse case. They advised that the mother of the child had been confronted by the doctor and actually admitted that she had been poisoning her child and that she was withdrawing blood from the child as well. I I knew about Munchausen by proxy, what they call it today, fictitious disorder by proxy. And immediately it triggered into my mind that I may have one of those cases. In a Munchausen by proxy case, the person themselves is Munchausen. And they cause their own illnesses or injuries to gain attention. And normally it's when they can't get attention for themselves anymore that they move on to a child.
Agent Smith calls FBI headquarters to talk to a profiler.
I knew that I was going to have to approach this interview differently. The behavioral analysis profiler told me to make the interview completely about her, to not talk about her children and the things that she did to the child, but to talk about how it affected her and how it made her feel. Just focus the entire interview on Wendy. I walked in, the chaplain was there, and Wendy Scott was there. You're expecting a monster, but in fact, she actually looks like a little child herself. She comes across very innocent, very naive, someone that you want to protect. Wendy showed absolutely no remorse during the interview. I realized that I did, in fact, have a Munchausen by proxy case, that she was truly injuring her child to gain attention for herself. And so my goal at that point was to get as much evidence as I could. I was able to get consent from Wendy to search the house. The home that the Scotts lived in was in a very nice area. The house was very organized and clean. Similarly, so was the victim child's bedroom. It was a beautiful bedroom. It looked like she cared very deeply for this child by the way that the room was presented. I spoke to the team leader of our evidence response team that went directly to the kitchen trash can. And sure enough, at the top of the trash can was a large bottle of milk and magnesia. And I saw a red hazmat box, the type you find in a doctor's office where you put expended syringes in. And inside were 5 syringes with blood in them. I actually took the photo books to see if they told any type of story. I was able to see things such as the child had straight hair. And I saw that Wendy had taken pictures of this victim child when she was putting curlers in her hair. I later interviewed the doctors at Walter Reed. They all described her as looking like Shirley Temple, who had curly hair. She wanted her daughter to look adorable and all the doctors to fall in love with her, to be the cutest kid on the floor, if you will. Wendy would do the child's hair in advance the night before, and then she would do something to the child to induce the symptoms that resulted in her bringing the child to the hospital. So it showed premeditation. I did learn through my investigation that Wendy herself had feigned illness at a previous base. She claimed she had leukemia, she was in a wheelchair, she'd shaved her head, she even shaved her eyebrows, literally had everyone absolutely convinced that she had it. She figured out a way to cause those type of symptoms in herself, and she was trying to do the same thing to her daughter.
Sean must now prove he is a fit parent to regain custody of his children.
I had a court date immediately. I had to hire my own attorney.
It was really devastating to him. But he picked himself up and began to make sure the children had a stable, safe place to be.
The evidence, timing, and Sean's record of conduct eventually exonerate him from suspicion.
Sean Scott had been serving his country, only to find that the enemy was not abroad. The enemy was in his own household, nearly killing his child. When the victim and the younger sibling were in Sean Scott's custody, they immediately started improving. The symptoms that the child presented with at Walter Reed Medical Center never, ever recurred.
After convincing a judge that I was a fit parent, I got legal custody of my children.
The case goes from FBI jurisdiction during the investigation to Maryland state prosecutors as they prepare for an indictment.
Agent Smith reviewed with me the information she received from Dr. Delormier, the attending physician at Walter Reed Medical Center. This woman was causing her child a near-death medical condition. The symptoms progressed to dramatic blood loss to the point where on 3 different occasions that the child had to be transfused. Dr. Delormier testified that the child could very well have died with the amount of blood that was taken from her system. It was dangerous enough that as a prosecutor, I had to make sure that she never had contact with that child again, with her younger child, or with any child. That was my focus.
On November 16, 2007, Wendy Scott is indicted on 15 charges.
She was charged with at least 2 counts of first-degree child abuse, second-degree child abuse, first-degree assault, second-degree assault, and reckless endangerment.
On March 13, 2008, Wendy Scott pleads guilty to first-degree child abuse.
In exchange for dismissing the remaining counts, the defense agreed that at sentencing, the parties would be free to argue as to what the appropriate sentence would be.
Wendy's sentencing hearing takes place 2 months later.
When she first came into court, she was just fluttering around, smiling, talking to people. It was clear she wanted to be the center of attention. But she did not testify during the sentencing hearing. The state presented testimony principally from Dr. Delormier. He was so incensed by this whole incident and what that child had suffered. Because of the blood loss levels, the myriad of tests that she had had to undergo, the radiology she was subjected to, his testimony went to the permanency of the injury to that young victim. The defense, they were arguing that she didn't intend to hurt the child. The only reason she was doing it was because of her own mental disorder. She'd been diagnosed with a borderline personality disorder. One of the manifestations of that was the fictitious disorder and fictitious disorder by proxy. But she knew that the blood she was withdrawing was causing the child to be transfused at least 3 times. And for her to say that she didn't know that what she was doing was causing harm is just not defensible.
Concerned that Wendy will present a further risk to her daughter if she gets a light sentence, the prosecution presents surprising evidence that her disorder is deeply rooted. Even while on bail, Wendy had been exhibiting classic fictitious disorder behaviors.
She decided to get a job, and while she was there, I discovered that she was faking cancer and diabetes. She would go on her lunch break and sit in her car on a 90-plus degree day, and then passing out, and that the ambulance would be called. She submits a request to this employer requesting time off, saying that she had lymphoma and that she needed to go for chemo on a weekly basis.
She was engaging in this very type of behavior, even at a time where she was participating in counseling and under the supervision of a psychiatric professional. She was doing this again.
This revelation seals Wendy's fate with the judge.
The judge sentenced her to 15 years of active incarceration and 5 years of supervised probation.
I had finally come to the realization that she was never going to stop doing this.
Sean takes off his wedding ring, files for divorce, and visits Wendy in jail one last time.
Within a couple of seconds of visiting her, and she looked down and she held my hand and she said, "Why did you take off your ring? Someone will fall in love with you. You can't do that." So I was just like, "I'm sorry." And she's like, "I think you need to go."
After 11 years of trauma, Sean is free to find love with a new partner and discovers there is light at the end of the tunnel.
My brother and Sean worked together at Walter Reed. We were both going through divorces about the same time, and we were friends. I wanted to help Sean primarily because I knew what a wonderful man he was. As a mother, it's an overwhelming story to hear. It still hurts to this day. Yeah, I felt terrible for him because it was a lot. And as a mom, like, our kids are close in age, so it really hit home. Our friendship grew more and more. Once his divorce was final, it was like an instant connection. Sean's children needed a lot of healing and love and support due to the damage that was caused by Wendy Scott.
In 2010, Sean and Rachel marry and blend their families. Rachel becomes the loving and protective mother Sean's kids have never known.
While Sean was deployed to Afghanistan, Wendy submitted a request for reconsideration. She wanted to reduce her prison time, and we feel that she coordinated that request in knowing that Sean was in Afghanistan, and so I attended that request. It was probably the most terrifying day of my life because I really didn't want to see Wendy in person, but I was also proud to speak on the kid's behalf because he was obviously not able to be there.
For the first time since her arrest, Wendy takes the stand.
You start by telling him your name.
Wendy Michelle Scott.
Do you have any children?
Yes, I do.
She obviously presented a very positive picture of her accomplishments.
Do you currently believe you're a danger to the community?
No, I am not.
Not one mention was made about the child. She knew that her counseling would not be successful if she was not able to be honest. So I asked her, tell me what you did to your daughter.
Ms. Scott, could you tell us, please, what you did to...
And she was very taken aback by that. The defense, of course, objected to it, and the judge wanted to hear the answer, too. She hemmed and she hawed.
Miss Angel, I am not a doctor. I cannot honestly, under oath, say that I know exactly what I did to her. I don't know.
And I don't think she ever really did answer my question. I just said, I have nothing more. I don't have any more questions.
And then I read a victim impact statement.
She works hard every single day of her life to try to be a typical kid. She will be scarred forever. It is something that we will deal with for the rest of her life.
And part of that was I had said that his daughter had her feeding tube removed. And as I was saying that, there was a cheer from Wendy, like, yay! Thank goodness I had the DA and the FBI agent on both sides of me because I think I would have done something mean. She did this to her daughter, and I'm the one that, along with Sean, we got rid of it and reached that milestone together. The damage and the harm that she did to an innocent little girl is just baffling. I think it's evil.
Ms. Scott, that sentence I imposed then is appropriate, and it remains appropriate. You nearly killed her, and your motion to modify is denied.
Wendy loses the appeal for a shortened sentence and serves her full term.
Sean and the kids are in a much better place. We all had to do the hard work together as a family. One of my proudest moments was to be by his side when he was promoted to lieutenant colonel because his career was almost destroyed because of Wendy. All 4 kids were at the ceremony, and of course, I cried. But it was just a very special day.
Sean is a proud and intensely private man, but he tells his story to warn others.
I'm at peace with it now. I'm okay. I cherish and appreciate the love and support that my wife and my children and my extended family and all my friends have given me to be able to get to the point. My purpose and mission will be to help somebody out there who's doubting themselves. Take action, don't hesitate, seek help. If you got doubts or questions, talk to somebody.
Sean is joyful in his new life and has high hopes for the future of his children.
They're strong, resilient children. I'm very proud of them. They're going to go on to do great things in their own right out there.
There is a profound silence that exists in the heart of the South Pacific, a quiet isolation that is both breathtakingly beautiful and intensely formidable. American Samoa, a self-governing territory of the United States, sits enveloped by the vast, endless expanse of the ocean. It is a place characterized by lush emerald landscapes, deep blue waters, and a rich cultural heritage, where community and family are traditionally held as the highest pillars of society. The territory is composed of a tight-knit population, where the villages scattered across the islands function as extended families. Neighbors know each other, generations grow up side by side, and the concept of anonymity is almost non-existent. Yet, as with any place where human nature resides, the idyllic surface can sometimes conceal a reality that is drastically and tragically different. It is within these close-knit boundaries that the most private horrors can unfold, shielded by the walls of a home and muffled by the heavy, tropical air. This duality between the serene external environment and the potential for domestic terror forms the chilling backdrop to a story that would forever alter the legal and social landscape of this island community. The village of Niueuli is one of the more prominent settlements on the main island, a place where daily life flows with the rhythm of the tides and the familiar routines of island living. In December of 2021, the atmosphere in Niueuli, much like the rest of the world, should have been one of anticipation and reflection. December is traditionally a time of gathering, a period when the oppressive heat of the year gives way to the festive spirit, and families come together to celebrate life, faith, and kinship. It is a month meant for creating memories and looking forward to the promise of a new year. However, within the confines of one particular household in this village, the festive season was entirely absent. Instead, the walls of that home were harboring a suffocating tension, a growing darkness fueled by elements that have historically destroyed countless lives across the globe. That darkness was rooted in the toxic combination of severe alcohol intoxication and a deep, blinding, and entirely baseless jealousy. It was a volatile mixture that was quietly reaching a boiling point, threatening to consume not just the man harboring it, but the innocent lives tethered to him. To understand the sheer magnitude of the tragedy that was about to unfold, one must first deeply consider the extreme vulnerability of the victim. Inside that house lived a woman who was carrying the most precious and fragile of burdens. She was 6 months pregnant. At 6 months, a pregnancy is no longer an abstract concept. It is a profound physical and emotional reality. The life inside her was established, growing rapidly and making its presence known with every movement. For a mother, reaching the second trimester brings a deep, instinctual bond with the unborn child, a biological imperative to nurture and protect that supersedes all else. She was carrying the future, a new life that represented hope and continuation. In a just world, a woman in this state should be surrounded by utmost care, respect, and unconditional protection, especially from the man who helped create that life. The home should be a sanctuary, a safe haven where she can prepare for the arrival of her child without fear. But for this woman in Niueuli, her sanctuary was about to be transformed into a locked cage, and the man who should have been her fiercest protector was rapidly deteriorating into her ultimate demise. The human mind, when warped by jealousy and saturated with alcohol, loses all tether to reason, empathy, and reality. Jealousy, in its most extreme and pathological form, is a consuming fire that requires no actual fuel to burn. It manufactures its own evidence, creates its own betrayals, and convinces the host that they are the victim of some imagined slight. When this psychological poison is amplified by heavy alcohol consumption, the results are almost always catastrophic. The alcohol strips away the inhibitions and moral safeguards that usually keep human behavior in check, leaving behind only raw, unfiltered aggression. The husband in this tragedy had surrendered himself entirely to this state. His mind, clouded by intoxication and distorted by possessive rage, ceased to see his wife as a human being, let alone the mother of his unborn child. He saw only the target of his irrational fury. The sequence of events that transpired on that fateful December day is a chilling study in calculated cruelty and complete loss of humanity. The act of violence did not begin with a sudden, heat-of-the-moment strike. It began with a deliberate, terrifying choice. The husband, heavily intoxicated and consumed by his jealous delusions, made the conscious decision to isolate his victim completely. He went to the door of their home and locked it from the inside. This single action is arguably one of the most horrifying details of the entire case. By locking the door, he was not merely securing a perimeter, he was intentionally cutting off her only route of escape. He was ensuring that her cries for help would go unanswered, that no neighbor or passerby could intervene, and that she would be entirely at his mercy. In that moment, the house in Newley ceased to be a home and became an inescapable execution chamber. The psychological terror the victim must have felt hearing the click of that lock, realizing that she was trapped with a monster, is a horror that defies comprehension. What followed was a brutal and sustained assault that completely disregarded the sanctity of life. The husband unleashed a torrent of physical violence upon his wife. This was not a tragic accident or a brief altercation. It was a prolonged, savage beating. As the blows landed, the victim was subjected to excruciating physical pain, but her primary concern, her most desperate instinct, was not just for her own survival. It was for the child growing inside her. The maternal instinct is a powerful force, and even in the face of insurmountable terror, she attempted to shield her abdomen, to absorb the impact of the violence to spare her unborn baby. She begged him. She pleaded with him, using the only leverage she had left, the life of their child. She pleaded for mercy, not just for herself, but for the innocent life that had absolutely no part in his drunken, jealous rage. She begged him to stop for the sake of the baby in her womb. Tragically, her pleas fell on deaf ears. The man standing over her was entirely devoid of empathy. The alcohol and the jealousy had completely deafened him to the desperate cries of his pregnant wife. The fact that she was carrying his child did nothing to slow his fists or calm his rage. He continued his relentless assault with a level of brutality that is difficult to process. He battered the woman he was supposed to love, completely ignoring her vulnerability, her pain, and her desperate supplications. The beating continued unabated until the unthinkable happened. The trauma inflicted upon her body was too severe. Her organs failed, her breathing stopped, and her life was violently extinguished. In that horrific process, the life of the 6-month-old fetus she was so desperately trying to protect was also terminated. 2 lives were erased in a matter of moments, snuffed out by the sheer, unadulterated violence of a man they should have been able to trust implicitly. The brutality of the murder is horrifying in its own right, but the events that occurred immediately following the victim's death add a layer of macabre callousness that shocks the conscience. When a human being commits an act of such extreme violence, especially against a loved one might expect a sudden snap back to reality, a moment of profound shock, panic, or devastating remorse once the deed is done and the silence falls. But for this perpetrator, there was no such realization. There was no desperate attempt to administer aid, no frantic call to emergency services, and absolutely no display of human regret. Having beaten his pregnant wife to death, the husband simply stopped. He looked at the lifeless body of the woman he had just murdered, the woman who still carried their dead child in her womb, and he made his next decision. He left her there on the floor. He ensured the room remained locked, sealing the horrific crime scene away from the eyes of the world, and then, He walked away. He did not flee in panic. He simply left the house to go find more alcohol. He abandoned the brutalized remains of his family to continue his drinking bout, a detail so profoundly disturbing that it highlights a complete and terrifying absence of a human soul. When the truth of what happened behind that locked door finally came to light, the impact on the community was seismic. The village of Niueuli, and indeed the entire territory of American Samoa, was plunged into a state of collective shock and intense mourning. The details of the case spread rapidly, and the reaction was one of unprecedented outrage. This was not just a domestic dispute that had gone too far. It was the slaughter of a defenseless, pregnant woman and her unborn child by a man who then casually went out to drink. The sheer callousness of the act struck a nerve deep within the societal fabric of the island. People were forced to confront the darkest aspects of domestic violence, stripping away the cultural tendencies to keep family matters private. The silence that often surrounds abuse in close-knit communities was shattered by the sheer volume of public anger. The tragedy resonated deeply because it highlighted a catastrophic failure to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The image of the pregnant mother, begging for her baby's life in a locked room, became a haunting symbol of the ultimate betrayal. The public outcry was so immense that it could not be ignored by the authorities. The waves of anger and grief reached the capital in Pago Pago, washing over the halls of government and demanding immediate and absolute action. For too long, the legal frameworks surrounding domestic violence in the territory had been perhaps too lenient, too archaic, or not rigorously enforced enough to prevent such atrocities. The murder in Niueuli laid bare the glaring inadequacies in the system meant to protect women and children. It forced a harsh mirror upon the lawmakers, showing them the deadly consequences of inaction. The tragic loss of the mother and her 6-month-old unborn child became the grim catalyst for a sweeping legislative overhaul. In Pago Pago, leaders and lawmakers were compelled to systematically review the entire structure of domestic violence laws. The incident dictated that new, stringent measures must be implemented to ensure that the victims of abuse are protected, that perpetrators face severe and immediate consequences, and that the cultural inclination to turn a blind eye to domestic violence is eradicated by the forceful hand of the law. This tragic case from December 2021 would no longer be just a memory of horrific violence, but the very foundation upon which a new, safer future for the women of American Samoa would have to be built, paid for by the tragic, irreplaceable loss of 2 innocent lives. To fully comprehend the sheer weight of the tragedy that unfolded in December 2021, it is absolutely essential to look beyond the horrific final act and understand the profound vulnerability of the life that was taken. We must examine the environment in which this victim lived, the physical and emotional reality she inhabited daily, and the suffocating invisible walls that had been built around her long before the physical door of her home was ever locked. The village of Niueuli, situated on the eastern side of the main island of Tutuila in American Samoa, provides a backdrop that is rich in natural beauty and community tradition. In this part of the world, life is intimately connected to the ocean, the lush tropical mountains, and the deeply ingrained cultural values that prioritize family structure and communal harmony. It is a place where the concept of the extended family, or AGA, forms the bedrock of society. In such a tight-knit environment, households are rarely isolated entities. People live in close proximity to their neighbors, extended relatives, and community leaders. There is a collective rhythm to daily existence, marked by shared meals, communal gatherings, and a general awareness of the comings and goings of those living nearby. Yet, this intense closeness creates a complex paradox when it comes to domestic violence. While the community is deeply interconnected, the sanctity of the private home is also fiercely guarded. The cultural emphasis on maintaining family honor and presenting a unified front can sometimes create an invisible, impenetrable barrier around the domestic sphere. For a victim of abuse living in such a setting, this means that while surrounded by people, she can experience a profound and terrifying sense of isolation. The cries for help might be stifled not just by physical walls, but by the overwhelming pressure to keep family struggles hidden from the collective gaze of the village. Within this complex social tapestry lived the victim, a woman whose daily existence was increasingly defined by the growing life inside her and the escalating volatility of the man she had married. To understand her position is to understand the absolute zenith of human vulnerability. At the time of her murder, she was 6 months pregnant. The 6th month of gestation is a pivotal, transformative period in a woman's life. By this stage, the pregnancy is no longer a hidden, internal reality. It is visible, undeniably present, and demanding of physical and emotional resources. At 24 weeks, a fetus is rapidly developing, responding to sounds, shifting and kicking, making its presence constantly known to the mother. This physical interaction fosters an incredibly deep biological and psychological bond. The maternal instinct, an ancient and powerful drive to nurture and protect, is fully awakened and dictates the mother's thoughts, actions, and priorities. She is eating for two, breathing for two, and envisioning a future entirely structured around the impending arrival of her child. Emotionally, it is a period often characterized by a nesting instinct, a desperate desire to create a safe, warm, and secure environment for the baby. But for this woman in New Orleans, the very space that should have been her safe haven was actively being transformed into a zone of unpredictable terror. The physical toll of carrying a child at 6 months is significant. A woman's center of gravity shifts, her mobility is altered, and she experiences a natural depletion of energy as her body works tirelessly to sustain the new life. She becomes physically dependent on a supportive environment. She requires rest, adequate nutrition, and above all, emotional stability. It is a time when she should be leaning on her partner, drawing strength from his support, and trusting him completely to act as the protector of their growing family. The tragic irony and the core horror of this case is that her designated protector was, in fact, her greatest and most lethal threat. Instead of a supportive partner, she was shackled to a man whose mind was increasingly consumed by a dark, toxic combination of severe alcoholism and pathological jealousy. This dynamic meant that every day was an exercise in hypervigilance and survival, a stark and devastating contrast to the peaceful anticipation that should characterize a pregnancy. To live with a partner consumed by baseless jealousy is to live in a constant state of psychological imprisonment. Jealousy, when it reaches the level of delusion, does not require facts, evidence, or reality to sustain itself. It is a self-feeding paranoia that twists every benign interaction, every look, and every moment of absence into a fabricated narrative of betrayal. For the victim, this meant that her world was steadily shrinking long before the day she was murdered. A pathologically jealous partner systematically isolates their victim. They interrogate their motives, control their interactions with friends and family, and create an atmosphere where the victim feels constantly watched, judged, and accused. The victim learns to modify her behavior, shrinking herself, quieting her voice, and avoiding any action that might trigger the irrational suspicions of her spouse. She walks on eggshells, constantly trying to appease an unappeasable mind. When this suffocating psychological control is coupled with the physical vulnerability of being heavily pregnant, the victim's isolation becomes absolute. She is trapped not just by fear, but by the physical reality of her condition, unable to easily flee, fight back, or seek refuge without endangering the child she is desperately trying to protect. This already volatile psychological landscape was heavily saturated and constantly ignited by the husband's severe abuse of alcohol. Alcohol operates as a powerful accelerant in domestic abuse situations. It lowers inhibitions, distorts cognitive processing, and completely erodes the emotional regulation required to maintain a peaceful coexistence. When the husband drank, the paranoid fantasies generated by his jealousy were amplified and perceived as undeniable truths. The alcohol stripped away any remaining veneer of restraint, transforming a suspicious spouse into an aggressive, unpredictable, and highly dangerous assailant. For the pregnant wife, the sound of a bottle opening or the smell of alcohol on his breath would have been a terrifying harbinger of impending violence. It meant that the man she knew was receding, replaced by a violent entity entirely detached from reason or empathy. She had to navigate this incredibly dangerous terrain daily, trying to predict the unpredictable, managing his moods, and desperately attempting to de-escalate situations before they turned physical, all while carrying the heavy physical and emotional burden of her pregnancy. We must picture the devastating reality of her daily life in the weeks and months leading up to December 2021. While the outside world in New Orleans went about its familiar routines, preparing for the festive season, attending church, and gathering with extended families, her world was confined to the claustrophobic reality of her abusive marriage. She was a woman caught in an impossible, agonizing bind. The societal expectations of maintaining a marriage and the cultural silence surrounding domestic violence likely made it incredibly difficult for her to reach out for help. Furthermore, the sheer mechanics of leaving an abusive relationship are exceptionally dangerous, and that danger is exponentially magnified when the victim is pregnant. Abusers often escalate their control and violence when they sense a loss of power or when the victim's attention shifts, which naturally happens during pregnancy as the mother focuses on the unborn child. She may have stayed out of fear that leaving would provoke him to ultimate violence, or out of a desperate, misplaced hope that the arrival of the baby might somehow change him, a tragic illusion that many victims cling to in the darkest moments of their ordeal. Her identity in this story must not be reduced merely to her final moments of suffering. She was a human being with a past, with hopes for the future, and with an immense capacity for love, evidenced by her desperate attempts to protect her unborn child until her very last breath. She represented the continuation of generations, a mother preparing to bring new life into the village of New Orleans. Her body was a vessel of hope, carrying a future member of their community. Yet, she was systematically stripped of her agency, her safety, and ultimately her humanity by the very person obligated to cherish her. The psychological torment she endured, living day in and day out with the knowledge that the father of her child was capable of horrific violence against her, is a burden too heavy to fully articulate. She experienced the unique, profound terror of knowing that her own home was the most dangerous place on earth for her and her baby. The portrait of this victim is a devastating illustration of the hidden epidemics that can ravage communities from the inside out. It forces a deeply uncomfortable confrontation with the reality that behind the beautiful scenery of the Pacific Islands, behind the strong cultural facades of family unity, there are women enduring silent, agonizing battles for their lives. She was not just a statistic. She was a mother, a wife, a member of the New Orleans community whose life was violently interrupted before it could truly blossom. Her vulnerability was absolute, dictated by biology and exploited by malice. She was a prisoner in her own home, guarded by a man whose jealousy blinded him to her humanity and whose drinking erased his conscience. By understanding the depth of her vulnerability, the suffocating nature of the jealousy she faced, the terrifying unpredictability of the alcohol-fueled rage she endured, and the profound, instinctual love she had for the child she was carrying, we begin to grasp the true, monumental scale of the tragedy that occurred. It was not just an act of violence. It was the systematic destruction of a vulnerable life, a devastating betrayal of the most fundamental human bonds, and a dark, tragic chapter that would forever stain the conscience of the territory. The atmosphere in the village of New Orleans on that specific December day carried the heavy, thick humidity typical of the South Pacific, a physical weight that seemed to mirror the unseen, suffocating tension building within the walls of one particular home. Outside, the world continued its mundane, rhythmic existence, with neighbors going about their daily routines, the sounds of village life drifting lazily through the tropical air. But inside the residence, the environment was rapidly deteriorating into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. The husband returned home in a state that had become terrifyingly familiar to his wife, his mind heavily saturated with alcohol and completely consumed by the dark, twisting tendrils of his own baseless jealousy. The physical manifestation of his intoxication was immediate and overwhelming, his movements erratic, his gaze clouded with a venomous anger that required no actual provocation. For the 6-month pregnant woman, his arrival in this condition was the realization of her deepest daily fears. She was acutely aware of the danger, her heightened maternal instincts screaming at her to protect the life growing inside her, yet she was physically constrained by the very space that should have been her sanctuary. The narrative of this tragedy pivots on one singular, deeply sinister action taken by the husband upon his arrival, an action that shifted the situation from a volatile domestic dispute to a calculated, inescapable execution. He walked to the main entrance of their home, closed the door, and deliberately engaged the lock from the inside. That metallic click, sharp and final in the tense quiet of the room, was the sound of a trap being irrevocably sprung. It was a conscious, predatory maneuver designed to isolate his victim entirely, ensuring that she could not flee and that no one from the outside world could intervene or even hear the horrors that were about to unfold. By severing her only connection to the safety of the village outside, he transformed their home into a sealed chamber of violence, establishing absolute control over the environment and the 2 lives trapped within it. The psychological devastation inflicted upon the victim in that exact moment is impossible to fully measure. She was standing in her own living space, carrying a child in her 2nd trimester, facing a physically imposing, deeply intoxicated man whose jealousy had stripped him of all reason, and she suddenly realized that there was no way out. The locked door was not just a physical barrier, it was a psychological weapon, a clear declaration of his intent to cause harm without interruption. It completely neutralized any advantage she might have had, trapping her in a confined area where her limited mobility due to the pregnancy became a fatal disadvantage. As the heavy reality of the locked door settled over the room, the husband's verbal barrage, fueled by the poisonous cocktail of liquor and paranoid delusion, escalated into severe physical violence. Jealousy, when amplified by extreme alcohol consumption, creates a hallucinatory reality for the abuser, wherein the victim is no longer a loved one but an absolute enemy who has committed unforgivable, albeit entirely fabricated, betrayals. He did not see a pregnant woman. He saw the focal point of his deranged insecurities. The transition from irrational accusation to brutal physical assault was devastatingly swift. He unleashed a torrent of rage upon his wife, striking out with a savagery that completely ignored her humanity, her vulnerability, and the sacred life she was nurturing within her body. For a pregnant woman, a physical assault is a dual terror. Every blow is not only a source of immense personal pain and trauma, but also a direct, lethal threat to the defenseless fetus she is biologically driven to protect at all costs. The biological imperative to safeguard the unborn child is arguably the strongest instinct in nature, and as the beating commenced, the victim's immediate, overriding response was not to fight back against her towering, enraged attacker, but to curl inward, to transform her own battered body into a human shield. She contorted herself, desperately trying to absorb the sheer force of his strikes, sacrificing her own limbs, her back, and her face to keep the violence away from her swollen abdomen. In the midst of this unbearable agony, she pleaded with him. Stripped of the ability to use quotations in this recounting, one can only describe the raw, primal desperation in her voice as she begged for mercy. She did not beg merely for her own survival. Her pleas were entirely focused on the innocent life caught in the crossfire of his unfounded rage. She implored him to consider the baby, desperately hoping that the mention of their unborn child would pierce through the thick, toxic fog of his drunken jealousy and awaken some dormant fragment of paternal instinct or basic human decency. She appealed to his conscience, to whatever lingering shred of love he might have once harbored, using her final reserves of energy to advocate for the infant who had no voice of its own. She tried to remind him of the future they were supposed to share, of the tiny heartbeat that was entirely dependent on her survival. It was a harrowing, deeply tragic display of unconditional maternal love, a mother enduring unspeakable torture while desperately trying to negotiate the survival of her child through a veil of excruciating pain and terror. However, the tragedy of this moment lies in the chilling reality that her desperate, agonizing pleas fell upon utterly deaf ears. The man standing over her was no longer a husband or a father. He was an empty vessel of violence, entirely consumed by the monstrous combination of alcohol and jealousy. His delusions had completely overridden his reality, blinding him to the heartbreaking sight of his pregnant wife trying to shield their baby. The alcohol had severed the neural pathways responsible for empathy and moral reasoning, leaving only a primitive, destructive drive. Instead of halting his assault, her vulnerability seemed to only fuel his aggressive frenzy. The brutality of the attack continued unabated, a relentless barrage of physical trauma that systematically destroyed her body's capacity to sustain life. The sheer physical force exerted upon her was catastrophic, overwhelming her desperate defensive postures and inflicting lethal internal injuries. The human body, especially one already under the immense physiological strain of a 6-month pregnancy, can only withstand so much trauma before it begins to shut down. Her cardiovascular system, already working overtime to support the fetus, was pushed beyond its limits by the severe physical trauma and the overwhelming shock of the assault. As the vicious beating progressed, her strength inevitably waned, her frantic pleas growing weaker, choked by pain, internal bleeding, and fading consciousness. The horrific climax of this prolonged assault was the ultimate failure of her vital systems. The trauma was simply too severe, the damage too extensive to survive. In that locked room, surrounded by the suffocating heat of the tropical afternoon, the life was violently beaten out of her. As she took her final, agonizing breath, the protective sanctuary of her womb became a tomb, the life of her 6-month-old unborn child extinguished alongside her own. The maternal body that was supposed to be the ultimate safe haven was transformed into a site of absolute devastation. 2 lives, intertwined by biology and bound by a mother's fierce but ultimately thwarted love, were erased in a matter of terrifying moments, their futures stolen by a senseless, deeply selfish act of violence. The cessation of the violence left behind a profound, deafening silence in the room, a stark and horrific contrast to the frantic, desperate struggle that had just taken place. It is in this immediate aftermath, in the quiet moments following the double murder, that the true, terrifying depth of the perpetrator's depravity was fully revealed. When a person commits a violent act in a sudden, uncontrollable rage, the immediate realization of the consequence often brings a crushing wave of shock, panic, or remorse. A normal human mind recoils at the sight of what it has done, the gravity of taking a life triggering a profound psychological collapse. But as the husband stood over the lifeless, battered body of the woman he had sworn to love, a woman who lay dead with their unborn child still trapped inside her, he exhibited absolutely no signs of human emotion. There was no frantic attempt to find a pulse, no desperate, tearful apologies whispered to the dead, and no panicked rush to unlock the door and scream for medical assistance. The magnitude of his crime, the slaughter of his own family, did not shatter the icy detachment that had taken root in his soul. He did not drop to his knees in despair, nor did he attempt to undo the horrific reality he had just created. Instead, his actions were characterized by a cold, methodical callousness that defies all understanding and challenges our fundamental definitions of humanity. Having finished his brutal assault, he simply stepped away from the devastation. He looked at the catastrophic result of his jealousy and his drinking, and he made the conscious decision that his primary concern was not the 2 lives he had just ended, but his own selfish, burning desire to continue consuming alcohol. Without a single backward glance of remorse, without a moment of hesitation or moral reckoning, he left the lifeless bodies on the floor of the very room where they had suffered their final, terrifying moments. He walked to the door, the same door he had purposefully locked to trap his wife inside, and he exited the house. In a final, chilling act of concealment, he ensured that the door was secured behind him, locking the gruesome crime scene away from the eyes of the village and leaving his murdered wife and child entirely abandoned in the suffocating stillness of the house. He then walked away, stepping back out into the bright, tropical reality of New Orleans, effectively leaving his unimaginable crime behind the closed door as he went out into the community to find more alcohol and resume his drinking binge. This sequence of events, from the calculated locking of the door to the relentless, fatal beating, the ignoring of her heartbreaking maternal pleas, and finally, the completely remorseless departure to continue a drunken stupor, encapsulates a level of psychological darkness that is profoundly difficult to process. It is a stark reminder of the absolute destruction that occurs when toxic jealousy is weaponized by severe alcohol abuse, creating a scenario where all human empathy is eradicated, leaving only a hollow, terrifying capacity for unprovoked and unapologetic slaughter. The locked room in that Newell house remains a dark, permanent monument to this failure of humanity, a space where the most sacred bonds of family were violently severed by a man who then simply walked away to have another drink, completely indifferent to the entire universe he had just destroyed with his own hands. The passage of time following the brutal act of violence within the locked house in Newell took on a surreal, agonizingly slow quality. Outside, the vibrant life of the village continued, completely oblivious to the fact that 2 lives had just been violently extinguished a mere few feet away from the bustling dirt roads and communal gathering spaces. However, in close-knit communities like those in American Samoa, anomalies in daily routines are rarely overlooked for long. The profound, unnatural silence emanating from a household that usually hummed with the daily activities of a growing family eventually began to cast a subtle, creeping shadow of concern over the immediate neighbors and extended relatives. It started with a missed casual greeting, a complete lack of movement around the property, and a general absence that felt sharply out of place for a woman who was 6 months pregnant and usually visible within the community. As the tropical afternoon began to stretch into the early evening, painting the Pacific sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, a growing sense of unease prompted an approach to the silent residence. The initial attempts to make contact were entirely benign, consisting of casual calls through the humid air and gentle knocks on the solid wooden door. But as those knocks went entirely unanswered, echoing hollowly against the structure, the benign concern rapidly metastasized into a cold, palpable dread. The realization that the door was firmly locked, securing the home in a manner that completely sealed it from the outside world, was the first concrete indicator that something was terribly amiss. In a culture where doors are frequently left open to welcome the ocean breeze and the company of neighbors, a heavily secured, completely silent house in the middle of the day was an alarming anomaly. The decision to force entry was not taken lightly, born of a desperate need to dispel the mounting anxiety, but the moment the physical barrier was breached, the anxiety was instantly replaced by an overwhelming, paralyzing horror. The atmosphere inside the home was heavy, stagnant, and utterly devoid of life. As the first individuals stepped cautiously over the threshold, their eyes were immediately drawn to the devastating tableau in the center of the main room. The discovery of the victim, her battered body bearing the horrific, undeniable evidence of a prolonged and savage beating, sent shockwaves of visceral trauma through those who found her. The tragedy was exponentially magnified by the visible reality of her advanced pregnancy, a silent, heartbreaking testament to the dual lives that had been stolen. The immediate, frantic checks for any faint sign of a pulse or a shallow breath were met with the cold, devastating finality of death. There was no life left to save. The frantic, desperate calls that subsequently flooded the local emergency lines were chaotic, fueled by a mixture of profound grief and sheer, unadulterated terror at the monstrous act that had defiled their peaceful village. The sudden arrival of the local authorities shattered the quiet evening of Newell. Vehicles from the police department in Pago Pago descended upon the village, their flashing blue and red lights casting an eerie, rhythmic glow against the lush tropical foliage, serving as a stark, mechanical intrusion into the natural beauty of the island environment. The seasoned investigators who stepped into the suffocating confines of the residence were immediately confronted with a crime scene of staggering, unfathomable brutality. The meticulous process of forensic analysis began immediately, serving as a clinical dissection of a deeply personal and horrific tragedy. Every overturned piece of furniture, every scattered household object, and every trace of violence was carefully documented, forming a grim, silent narrative of the pregnant victim's final, desperate moments on Earth. The investigators were particularly struck by the heartbreaking defensive wounds mapped across the victim's arms and hands. This was physical evidence that perfectly corroborated the tragic reality that she had spent her final moments desperately trying to absorb the punishing blows in a futile attempt to protect her unborn child. But the most chilling piece of the investigative puzzle, the specific element that transformed the scene from a tragic domestic dispute gone wrong into a calculated, cold-blooded murder, was the state of the primary entryway itself. The forensics team meticulously examined the locking mechanism, confirming the horrifying suspicion that the perpetrator had deliberately sealed the exit from the inside before initiating the attack, and subsequently secured it again upon leaving. This crucial detail completely eliminated any possibility of an accidental death or a sudden crime of passion where the assailant panicked and immediately fled in a chaotic frenzy. It indicated a terrifying level of predatory control and deliberate isolation. The locked door meant the killer had total command over the victim's fate and had systematically cut off her only avenue of escape. Furthermore, the complete absence of the husband from the crime scene, coupled with the locked door, immediately cast a blinding, inescapable spotlight of suspicion directly upon him. He was the only other adult resident of the home, the father of the unborn child, and his sudden disappearance in the immediate wake of such a massacre was the most glaring anomaly of all. The investigation rapidly transitioned from a localized crime scene assessment into an urgent, island-wide manhunt. The authorities needed to locate the husband not just as a primary person of interest, but as an actively dangerous individual whose capacity for extreme, lethal violence had just been devastatingly demonstrated to the entire territory. The hunt for the perpetrator did not lead the investigators on a high-speed chase across the island, nor did it require navigating dense, treacherous jungles in search of a fugitive desperate to evade capture. Instead, the pursuit culminated in a discovery that was profoundly disturbing in its utter banality and absolute lack of human conscience. The investigators, utilizing local intelligence and tracing the most likely patterns of behavior for a man heavily struggling with severe alcoholism, directed their search toward the local establishments and informal gathering spots known for heavy drinking. Within mere hours of discovering the catastrophic crime scene, they successfully located the husband. He had not fled to the remote corners of the territory, nor was he hiding in a state of terrified remorse. He was found at a nearby location, deeply intoxicated, casually consuming alcohol alongside others, as if the horrific slaughter of his entire family had never occurred. The sheer audacity of his location and his completely relaxed demeanor struck the arresting officers with a wave of intense disgust. When physically confronted by the authorities, his reaction was completely devoid of shock, grief, or even panicked confusion. Instead, he presented a highly calculated facade of drunken ignorance, attempting to weave a clumsy, incoherent narrative to instantly distance himself from the bloodshed back at his home. This marked the introduction of a pathetic and deeply flawed alibi, a desperate psychological attempt to manipulate the truth in the face of overwhelming circumstantial evidence. He slurred his way through a fabricated timeline, vehemently suggesting that he had left the house hours ago to socialize and had left his pregnant wife alive, perfectly well, and resting peacefully inside the locked home. He attempted to plant the seed of an alternative theory, vaguely hinting that an unknown, violent intruder must have broken into the home during his absence to commit the heinous act. This attempt at misdirection was a classic, albeit poorly executed, tactic employed by perpetrators of domestic homicide, heavily relying on the desperate hope that a lack of direct eyewitnesses could cast just enough reasonable doubt to spare them the severe legal consequences of their actions. However, his alcohol-addled mind had completely failed to account for the physical, forensic realities of the crime scene he had left behind, specifically the very mechanical trap he had set with the door. The transition from the open, humid air of the village to the sterile, brightly lit interrogation room in Pago Pago marked the final, systematic dismantling of the husband's fragile web of lies. The investigators, armed with the precise, undeniable facts gathered from the newly scene, sat across from the suspect, methodically dissecting his fabricated alibi piece by piece. The interrogation was not a theatrical screaming match, but a cold, highly calculated presentation of inescapable truths designed to break his psychological defenses. They patiently allowed him to reiterate his elaborate story about an unknown intruder, carefully noting every contradiction, every impossible timeline, and every stuttering hesitation. Then they began to introduce the physical evidence. They presented the incontrovertible fact of the locked door, explaining precisely how the locking mechanism forensically proved that the house had been secured by someone intentionally leaving, not forcibly broken into by a random assailant entering. They highlighted the complete absence of any forced entry on the windows or hinges, completely nullifying his phantom intruder theory. The investigative net tightened even further as forensic experts examined the suspect's own physical condition in the holding area. Hidden beneath the overpowering, stale stench of alcohol were the telltale, physical signs of a deeply violent struggle. Microscopic traces of biological material and blood spatter that would later perfectly match the pregnant victim were found embedded within the fibers of his clothing, invisible to his drunken eyes, but glaringly obvious under rigorous forensic scrutiny. Furthermore, his hands bore the distinct, undeniable bruising, swelling, and deep abrasions entirely consistent with delivering a prolonged, savage beating against a human body, physical injuries that completely and utterly contradicted his claim of having spent the afternoon peacefully drinking with acquaintances. As the lead investigators meticulously laid out this monumental mountain of irrefutable evidence across the table, the suspect's arrogant demeanor began to visibly fracture. The protective facade of drunken ignorance slowly crumbled, rapidly replaced by a sullen, cornered realization that his elaborate fiction had utterly failed to deceive anyone. He could not logically explain how a random intruder could have locked the door from the outside and vanished with the only key, a specific key that was subsequently found resting heavily in his own pocket during the pat-down at the time of his arrest. He could not explain away the victim's blood on his garments or the extensive, violent damage to his own knuckles. The meticulously constructed locked room mystery, originally intended to be his ultimate shield against prosecution, had ultimately become the absolute, binding proof of his guilt. The interrogation culminated not in a dramatic, tearful confession of remorse, but in a defeated, heavy, and deeply cowardly silence. The undeniable weight of the forensic evidence, powerfully combined with the sheer logical impossibility of his drunken alibi, left absolutely no room for alternative theories or reasonable doubt. The investigators formally charged him with a double homicide, officially placing him under arrest for the brutal, senseless murder of his wife and their unborn child. The rigorous investigative process had swiftly and decisively cut through the toxic fog of his jealousy and alcohol-induced lies, securing the first crucial step toward justice for the victims and ensuring that the man solely responsible for tearing a family apart would now face the full, unforgiving, and heavy force of the judicial system in American Samoa. The courtroom in Pago Pago was transformed into a somber stage where the raw, agonizing truth of the December tragedy was finally laid bare before the eyes of the public and the formal gaze of the law. The legal proceedings that followed the arrest were not merely a routine series of hearings, but a profound, collective reckoning for the territory of American Samoa. The atmosphere inside the chamber was heavy with a palpable sense of grief and indignation as the community converged to bear witness to the resolution of a crime that had irrevocably shattered their sense of security. Every seat in the gallery was filled, the air thick with the silent, collective demand for accountability as the judge took the bench to preside over the trial of the man who had extinguished 2 lives within the confines of their own home. The prosecution's strategy was marked by a chilling, methodical precision, designed to strip away the veneer of the defendant's weak, alcohol-fueled denials and present the horrific, naked reality of his actions to the court. As the lead prosecutor opened the case, the narrative moved away from the chaotic, drunken excuses offered during the initial investigation and focused entirely on the cold, calculated sequence of events that defined the murder. They brought forward a succession of forensic experts, forensic pathologists, and law enforcement officers who had processed the scene at Newely, each providing a piece of evidence that collectively dismantled the defendant's flimsy defense. The pathologist's testimony was particularly harrowing, providing a detailed, medical account of the sheer brutality inflicted upon the pregnant victim. They described the internal injuries in clinical, haunting detail, explaining how the force of the blows had systematically destroyed the victim's ability to survive. When the pathologist touched upon the physical trauma endured by the 6-month-old fetus, a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, a visible manifestation of the profound horror that this case had evoked across the island. The defense, clearly aware of the overwhelming weight of the forensic evidence, attempted to lean heavily into the mitigating factor of the defendant's severe intoxication. They argued, with increasing desperation, that the defendant's state of mind at the time was so profoundly impaired by his alcohol consumption that he could not have formed the specific intent required for premeditated murder. They painted a picture of a man spiraling into a deep, alcohol-induced psychosis, claiming his actions were the impulsive, uncontrollable outbursts of a man lost to his own chemical dependency. However, this defense was fundamentally undermined by the critical, damning detail of the locked door. The prosecution countered this argument with masterful simplicity, pointing out that the act of locking the door from the inside required a level of conscious, deliberate, and sustained cognitive function that directly contradicted any claims of blind, impulsive rage. They argued that the act of trapping the victim was the ultimate, irrefutable evidence of a pre-planned execution, a maneuver that required the defendant to pause, reach for the lock, and deliberately secure it to ensure his victim's total isolation. This detail effectively neutralized the intoxication defense, illustrating that even in a state of alcoholic obsession, the defendant possessed the awareness to act with calculated, predatory intent. Throughout the trial, the defendant sat at the defense table, largely withdrawn, his demeanor reflecting the same cold, detached indifference he had displayed when found drinking in the immediate aftermath of the killing. He rarely made eye contact with the families of the victim, who sat in the front rows, their faces etched with the deep, permanent lines of their grief. Their presence served as a powerful, silent indictment of the man who had stolen their daughter and their unborn grandchild. The trial also featured testimony that painted a vivid, heartbreaking portrait of the victim's life in the months leading up to the murder. Friends and neighbors spoke of her growing, quiet isolation, of the subtle, chilling ways the defendant had curtailed her freedom, and of the profound, unspoken fear that had begun to define her existence within the walls of their home. These testimonies provided the human context that the clinical forensic evidence lacked, forcing the court to confront the reality that the defendant's actions were not a singular, spontaneous eruption of violence, but the final, brutal culmination of an established pattern of control and abuse. This evidence was pivotal in shifting the perspective of the proceedings, framing the crime not just as a murder, but as the final, absolute destruction of a life that had been slowly caged long before the physical blows were ever struck. The defense's attempt to characterize the defendant as a man merely overwhelmed by his own demons was effectively decimated by this testimony, which highlighted the sustained, deliberate nature of the domestic violence he had exercised. As the trial moved toward its closing, the courtroom was gripped by an intense, suffocating stillness. The jury, comprised of members of the community who had lived under the shadow of this tragedy for months, appeared visibly affected by the weight of the testimonies and the undeniable nature of the evidence. When the jury retired to deliberate, the city of Pago Pago seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the verdict that would finally place a period at the end of this horrific chapter. The hours of deliberation felt like an eternity, but the result, when it finally arrived, was swift and decisive. The verdict, delivered in a clear, resonant voice, found the defendant guilty on all counts, including the murder of his wife and the termination of the unborn child. The announcement of the verdict did not bring joy, for there could be no true victory in such a profound tragedy, but it brought a grim, necessary measure of justice. The sentencing phase that followed was equally intense, as the judge addressed the defendant directly, speaking to the absolute, unforgivable nature of his crimes. The judge articulated the profound betrayal of trust inherent in the killing of a pregnant woman, emphasizing that the sanctity of the home had been violated in the most heinous way possible. The sentence imposed was severe, a reflection of the court's total condemnation of the violence that had devastated the Newelley community. As the defendant was led away from the courtroom to begin his long, irrevocable sentence, the silence that hung in the air was finally broken by the soft, choked sobs of the victim's family, a sound that underscored the permanent, lingering ache of their loss. The courtroom drama had concluded, but the impact of the trial rippled far beyond the courthouse walls. The proceedings had been a forced, necessary confrontation with the dark realities of domestic violence in the territory, a trial that refused to let the community look away from the truth. The legal system had fulfilled its primary duty, ensuring that the perpetrator of such a savage, calculated crime would face the full, unyielding weight of justice, and in doing so, it provided the essential, final step in the process of holding the defendant accountable for the lives he had stolen. The trial stood as a somber, permanent testament to the cost of silence and the vital importance of the law in shielding the vulnerable, serving as a dark landmark in the history of the island, a moment where the full, cold reality of the tragedy was finally and irrevocably brought to light and sentenced by the collective conscience of the society. The closure of the case, while bringing the legal process to a definitive end, did not erase the memory of the events of that December day, nor did it return the stolen lives, but it established a clear, judicial record of the crime, ensuring that the history of what happened in that locked room in New Orleans would remain documented, analyzed, and condemned by the people of American Samoa for generations to come. A reminder of the fragility of life and the immense, enduring necessity of vigilance. In the face of such profound, domestic darkness, the echoes of the courtroom verdict in Pago Pago did not simply dissipate. Instead, they resonated through the very foundations of the American Samoan community, forcing a long-overdue reckoning with the realities of domestic violence. This tragedy in New Orleans acted as a jagged, painful catalyst, stripping away the comfort of denial and demanding a fundamental shift in how the territory perceived, reported, and legislated against the sanctity of the private home. The murder of a pregnant woman, a life force, a bearer of the next generation, became an undeniable, horrifying symbol of the ultimate failure of protection. It was no longer possible for local society to hide behind the cultural nuances of family privacy when that privacy had been weaponized to systematically cage, torture, and execute two innocent human beings. The public outrage, which had initially manifested as raw, unfiltered shock and grief, began to coalesce into a powerful, organized movement for systemic change. The citizens of the territory, who had for so long lived with the quiet, nagging fear of domestic instability, finally found a unified voice, demanding that their lawmakers enact measures that would prioritize the safety of women and children over the traditional pressures of maintaining family appearances at any cost. This shift in public sentiment was not just a temporary reaction to a gruesome news cycle, it was a profound, cultural transformation that fundamentally altered the social contract within the islands. The legislative response in Pago Pago was both immediate and sweeping, reflecting the urgency of the moment and the grim gravity of the crime. Lawmakers, confronted with the reality that their current systems had left a vulnerable woman trapped in a house of horrors, began to undertake a rigorous, top-to-bottom review of existing domestic violence statutes. The objective was clear: to eliminate the loopholes that allowed abusers to maintain control and to foster an environment where victims could seek refuge without the fear of retribution. New, stringent protections were drafted, focusing on the swift issuance of restraining orders, the provision of safe housing for those at risk, and the establishment of dedicated intervention programs designed to identify and disrupt the cycle of abuse before it could escalate to such a lethal outcome. The authorities recognized that the case in New Orleans was not just an anomaly, it was a symptom of a systemic inability to intervene effectively in the lives of those suffering behind closed doors. Consequently, the new legal framework emphasized the empowerment of community leaders, social workers, and law enforcement to act with greater authority and decisiveness in domestic disputes. It was an admission that the safety of the individual must take precedence over the traditional silence, and that the territory's laws needed to be robust enough to shield its most vulnerable members from the lethal intersection of toxic jealousy and uncontrolled substance abuse. The reflection on this tragedy goes far beyond the walls of the legislature or the procedural outcomes of the trial. It requires an introspection that touches the very heart of the community's identity. The loss of the victim and her unborn child remains an open wound, a constant reminder of the horrific cost of societal complacency. As time passed, the memory of that December in 2021 served as a somber marker, a point in time before and after which the community's commitment to domestic safety changed forever. The tragedy forced the people of American Samoa to confront the uncomfortable reality that abuse does not occur in a vacuum. It is often ignored or downplayed by the very people who have the best opportunity to see the warning signs. The lessons learned from the Newell murder have been integrated into education and awareness campaigns, encouraging neighbors to speak up, families to prioritize the well-being of their members over the preservation of an image, and individuals to recognize the early indicators of pathological jealousy and the dangerous, volatile influence of alcohol. It is a slow, difficult process of unlearning long-standing cultural norms that have historically muffled the cries of victims, but it is a process that is now underway, fueled by the memory of 2 lives that were sacrificed for the sake of an abusive man's fragile, deranged ego. In the final analysis, the story of the Newell tragedy is a testament to the immense, enduring necessity of vigilance. It is a narrative that highlights the fragile boundary between the home as a place of sanctuary and the home as a place of terminal danger. For the victim, her house was her life, and ultimately, it became her grave. Her story continues to be told not to gratify a curiosity for the macabre, but to ensure that her loss was not in vain. Her life and the life of her child have become the standard against which all future protection efforts are measured. Every time a new law is enforced, every time a neighbor intervenes in a dispute, and every time a victim reaches out for help, there is a reflection of the change that began in the wake of her death. The tragedy, as devastating as it was, became the foundation upon which a new, safer future for the women and children of American Samoa is currently being constructed. The legal and legislative strides taken in Pago Pago, the shift in community consciousness, and the ongoing dialogue about domestic safety are all tributes to the lives lost in that locked room. It is a legacy defined by an unwavering commitment to never again allow such a horror to occur in the shadows. As we reflect on the deeper, moral implications of this case, we are forced to acknowledge the terrifying vulnerability of the human spirit when confronted with deliberate malice. The perpetrator's actions, his calculated locking of the door, his sustained violence, and his callous indifference in the aftermath represent the furthest possible deviation from human empathy. However, the response of the community represents the resilience of humanity, the ability to face even the most disturbing truths, to demand justice, and to work tirelessly to prevent the recurrence of such evil. The memory of the victim and her unborn baby remains as a haunting, permanent presence in the cultural landscape of the territory, serving as a beacon of warning and a call to action. It is a reminder that silence is a choice, and that in the face of domestic brutality, neutrality is effectively an act of complicity. By choosing to speak, to legislate, and to protect, the people of American Samoa are attempting to balance the scales of justice that were so violently tipped on that day in December. The case will forever be a part of the history of the island, a dark, defining chapter that necessitated a complete overhaul of how the territory views its duty to those who are suffering within the privacy of their own homes. In the quiet, lush landscapes of Newell, life continues, yet it is forever marked by the ghosts of that winter day. The tropical breeze still blows, the ocean tides still rhythmically rise and fall, and the village persists as a place of community, but with a heightened sense of responsibility and a sharper awareness of the darkness that can lurk behind familiar doors. The story of the pregnant mother and her unborn child is now interwoven with the social consciousness of the territory, a constant, solemn reminder of the immense cost of failing to protect the most vulnerable. While the law has provided its answer and the judicial system has fulfilled its mandate, the true, lasting legacy of this case resides in the change it ignited within the hearts and minds of the people. It is a transformation born of profound grief and a collective resolve to ensure that no more lives are erased by the unchecked power of domestic rage. The story ends, but the work, the ongoing, tireless effort to sustain a society that values life, protects the defenseless, and rejects the toxic, silent patterns of abuse, continues unabated, honoring the lives that were so cruelly taken by ensuring that their memory inspires a future defined by safety, transparency, and an absolute intolerance for the violence that once shattered their world. The tragedy remains a lesson in the frailty of human existence and the absolute, non-negotiable importance of communal vigilance, a case that will never be forgotten and one that serves as a permanent, moral anchor in the ongoing struggle to protect the sanctity of life within the home. The final echoes of this case are not of despair, but of a quiet, steady, and resolute commitment to never again allow the silence of the village to mask the screams of the dying, turning a page of history toward a future where every home in the islands can truly be the sanctuary it was always meant to be. The resolution of the legal proceedings and the subsequent legislative overhaul in Pago Pago marked a critical turning point for the territory, yet the psychological and societal aftermath of the Newell tragedy remains a profound and enduring presence. The act of violence itself was so absolute and so deeply embedded in the betrayal of domestic trust that its ripples continue to influence the cultural fabric of American Samoa. To reflect upon this case is to engage with the complex intersection of tradition, modernity, and the difficult reality of human darkness. The transition from a society that historically leaned toward keeping familial struggles internal to one that now actively demands external intervention represents a monumental shift in consciousness. This transition was forged not through abstract policy debate, but through the visceral, shared trauma of witnessing the destruction of a mother and her unborn child. The silence that once served as a cloak for domestic abuse has been replaced by an increasingly vocal, community-wide acknowledgement that such violence is not a private matter, but a public crime that demands an unwavering collective response. Every facet of life in the village of Newell and across the islands now carries a heightened awareness of the risks of isolated domestic situations, and there is a renewed, aggressive commitment to ensuring that the warning signs, those subtle shifts in behavior, the creeping isolation, and the manifestations of possessive control, are recognized and addressed long before they escalate into fatal consequences. This ongoing cultural evolution is perhaps the most significant legacy of the tragedy. It is reflected in the way schools, churches, and community organizations now integrate awareness of domestic violence into their routine messaging, moving beyond the superficial to address the root causes of toxic behavior. There is a concerted effort to dismantle the antiquated expectations that often kept victims trapped, fostering instead a supportive network where seeking help is viewed as an act of courage rather than a source of shame. The memory of the victim has become a beacon for this change, her story a recurring point of reference in the dialogue about what it means to be a safe, protective community. In this sense, the tragedy has served to redefine the value of human life within the territory, emphasizing that the sanctity of the individual is paramount, especially when that individual is in a position of extreme vulnerability. The legal reforms enacted by the lawmakers in Pago Pago provided the teeth for this shift, but the true, lasting strength of the movement resides in the people themselves, in the neighbors who now look out for one another with more intention, in the friends who are more willing to question the behavior of their peers, and in the families who have collectively decided that the protection of their members is more important than the preservation of a flawed domestic status quo. The psychological impact on the investigators, the first responders, and the community members who witnessed the aftermath of the crime is a dimension of the tragedy that is often overlooked in official reports. Those who were forced to confront the horrific scene in the locked house carry the memory of that day as a permanent, haunting weight. Their commitment to the judicial process and their tireless work during the investigation were driven by a profound desire to ensure that justice was served, but they also serve as the custodians of a memory that must not be sanitized or forgotten. Their testimonies and their forensic dedication have documented a level of depravity that serves as a necessary, if deeply painful, record for posterity. This record is not meant to be celebrated, but to be studied and understood as a clear warning of the catastrophic potential of unbridled jealousy and substance abuse. By preserving the truth of what occurred, They have ensured that the defendant's actions are fully documented for all time, leaving no room for the distortion of history or the minimization of the crime. This dedication to factual accuracy and justice acts as a buffer against the erosion of truth that often follows the passage of time, ensuring that the gravity of the lives stolen remains firmly embedded in the community's collective memory. As the years continue to move forward, the case of the Newell murder remains a foundational, albeit tragic, chapter in the narrative of American Samoa. It has fundamentally changed the baseline of what is acceptable behavior in personal relationships and has codified the state's obligation to act decisively in the face of domestic peril. The memory of the mother and her 6-month-old child stands as a silent, powerful indictment of the violence that was visited upon them, and their legacy is the safer, more vigilant society that has emerged in the aftermath of their passing. The territory has proven capable of profound transformation, demonstrating that even in the face of the most devastating and demoralizing of events, a community can choose to rise, to learn, and to construct a future that is defined by protection and compassion. The tragedy forced the hand of history, and the resulting evolution in law and social consciousness is a testament to the resilience and the moral imperative of the people. They have taken an act of utter, senseless destruction and, through immense collective effort, have translated it into a lasting, protective barrier against the future repetition of such horrors. Reflecting on the deeper, philosophical implications of this case, we are once again confronted with the realization that the most profound dangers often arise in the places where we feel the most secure. The home, which should be the bedrock of human stability, was transformed into a site of ultimate predation, a reality that challenges the fundamental trust required for human society to function. This betrayal of trust is the defining element of the case, and it serves as a permanent, chilling reminder of the limits of our ability to know the true nature of those closest to us. It forces an uncomfortable humility, reminding us that the dark impulses of the human heart are not easily predicted or fully understood by those on the outside. Consequently, the only defense against such volatility is an unwavering commitment to transparency, to the active support of the vulnerable, and to the refusal to let the shroud of privacy obscure the truth of abuse. The story ends, but the vigilance it demands must be perpetual, as the conditions that fostered the jealousy and rage of that day in December remain persistent, lurking threats in the shadows of any society. The Newell case remains a cautionary tale that the price of safety is constant, tireless, and communal observation. In the final accounting, the narrative of this tragedy is one of profound loss, but also one of significant, hard-won progress. The community has not allowed itself to be defined solely by the horror of the event, but rather by the strength and urgency of its response. The legacy of the victims lives on in every woman who feels safer today, in every child who is protected by more robust legal frameworks, and in every village that has become more attuned to the needs of its members. The story of the pregnant mother and her unborn child, while agonizing, has become a catalyst for a healthier, more conscious, and more protective society. The memory of what happened in that locked room in Newell will likely never fully fade from the minds of those who lived through it, but it has been successfully channeled into a force for good, a reminder of the fragility of existence and the absolute, non-negotiable duty to safeguard the lives of others. The final page of this record is not an ending, but a continuing commitment to the values of justice, safety, and human dignity, ensuring that the legacy of those who were lost is a future where the home is, once again, a place of peace, and where the silence of the village is a reflection of security rather than a mask for tragedy. This commitment is the highest honor that can be paid to those whose lives were stolen, and it is the ultimate, necessary conclusion to a saga that changed the history of the territory forever, leaving an indelible, solemn mark on the conscience of all who recognize the absolute value of every innocent life. The quiet, green hills of Newell now look out over a community that has matured in its understanding of the dark and light of human nature, a community that stands as a stronger, more united, and more vigilant protector of its own, forever mindful of the shadows that can gather behind a locked door, and forever dedicated to the principle that no one should ever again be forced to endure such agony and isolation, ensuring that the memory of the past guides the hand of the future toward a horizon where such violence is not just forbidden, but entirely unimaginable. The final chapter of this tragic narrative is not merely a conclusion to a single legal case, but the beginning of an enduring societal commitment to vigilance that has forever altered the landscape of American Samoa. As time moves forward, the memory of the events in Niuelau in December 2021 continues to serve as an anchor for the territory's evolving social and legal conscience. It is a memory that refuses to fade because it is woven into the very fabric of the new policies, the community awareness programs, and the protective instincts that now characterize the daily lives of the residents. The tragedy has forced a departure from the historical inclination to view domestic issues as strictly private, internal family matters. Instead, there is now an overwhelming, collective recognition that when the safety of a woman or a child is at stake, the entire community has a stake in the outcome. This fundamental shift has been institutionalized in the way the territory approaches domestic disputes, prioritizing the safety of the victim above all other considerations, including the preservation of family honor. The lessons extracted from that locked room are now taught in the schools, discussed in the churches, and reinforced by the police department, creating a layered system of protection that aims to prevent the resurgence of the dark, isolated violence that caused such irreparable harm. The legacy of the victim and her unborn child is found in the improved response times of emergency services, the more rigorous training provided to those tasked with domestic intervention, and the increased availability of support systems for those feeling trapped by abusive partners. Every time a neighbor chooses to step in, every time a relative offers a safe haven, and every time the legal system moves with efficiency to issue protection orders, the memory of that December tragedy is honored in the most meaningful way possible, through the active, life-saving protection of the vulnerable. It is a testament to the fact that while the loss of life can never be reclaimed, the environment in which that loss occurred can be fundamentally transformed to ensure that such a tragedy is not repeated. The territory's commitment to this cause is now a defining feature of its governance, a clear declaration that the safety of its citizens is the ultimate measure of its progress as a modern, responsible society. This dedication is not a static achievement, but a dynamic, ongoing process that requires constant attention and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable realities that continue to exist in the hidden corners of any community. Looking back at the path taken since that harrowing December, one cannot help but be struck by the resilience of the people of American Samoa. Faced with the reality of a brutal, cold-blooded murder committed by a member of their own community, they did not recoil into a defensive or indifferent silence. Instead, they demanded accountability, they sought truth, and they embarked on a rigorous path of reform. This response is perhaps the most significant aspect of the entire case, as it demonstrates a moral maturity that is capable of transforming the most profound of tragedies into a source of collective strength. The investigators, the legal professionals, and the community leaders who navigated the complexities of this case have set a standard for how such atrocities are to be addressed, ensuring that justice is not just a concept but a tangible, functioning reality. Their work has provided a blueprint for how to handle the dark, complex nature of domestic crime, leaving a legacy of transparency and resolve that will serve the territory for generations to come. The case has become a permanent, sobering fixture in the historical record, a landmark that informs the collective wisdom of the population. The philosophical reflection that stems from this tragedy forces us to consider the nature of home and the inherent vulnerability of the relationships we build within them. The home is intended to be a sanctuary, a place where life is nurtured and protected, yet the Niuelau case exposes the terrifying potential for that sanctuary to be subverted into a place of mortal danger. This realization is a bitter pill, but it is an essential one for the growth of any society. It mandates a level of openness and mutual responsibility that challenges the traditional boundaries of the household, emphasizing that the health of our private relationships is inextricably linked to the well-being of the broader community. The tragedy serves as a constant, quiet reminder that the most profound dangers often arise when we become too comfortable, too trusting, and too insular. It teaches us that vigilance is not an act of suspicion, but an act of love, a way of ensuring that our loved ones are protected from the dangers that can arise from within, as well as those that come from without. This perspective has fundamentally changed the way people in the islands connect with one another, fostering a more intentional, caring, and protective approach to the ties that bind them. In the final assessment, the story of the pregnant mother and her unborn child is a story that refuses to be silenced by the passage of time. Her life and the life of her child have taken on a symbolic importance that transcends the tragedy itself, representing the preciousness of every life and the absolute duty of a society to protect the defenseless. Their memory acts as a persistent, moral compass for the territory, a constant influence on the decisions made by leaders and the actions taken by citizens alike. The silence that once surrounded the tragedy has been replaced by an ongoing, necessary dialogue about the realities of domestic abuse, ensuring that the lessons learned remain at the forefront of the community's consciousness. This enduring commitment to safety and truth is the greatest possible honor that could be paid to those whose futures were stolen, and it is the only possible path toward a future where the home is, truly and without qualification, a place of peace. The tragedy will always remain a dark, painful scar, but it is a scar that has healed into a mark of resilience, a constant reminder of the strength and the resolve of a community that has chosen to define itself by its protection of the innocent rather than by the violence of the few. The narrative of this case, while ending in a place of somber resolution, carries with it an eternal imperative. The future of American Samoa, and indeed the future of any community that seeks to honor the lives of the fallen, must be built upon the pillars of awareness, action, and unyielding support for the vulnerable. The tragedy in Niueule has provided the territory with a clear mandate to remain forever awake to the realities of domestic violence, ensuring that the shadows never again grow long enough to conceal such horrors. This is the enduring, monumental legacy of the lives lost in that locked room. It is a legacy of empowerment, a legacy of reform, and a legacy of unity in the face of absolute, unprovoked evil. The final, lingering echoes of this case are not of the silence that followed the crime, but of the voices that rose up afterward to demand change, to seek justice, and to foster a new culture of safety and care. These voices are the true authors of the future, ensuring that the memory of the past guides the hand of the territory toward a horizon defined by the enduring, unshakable value of every human life. As we move toward the future, the lessons of this December in 2021 remain as vital as they were when they first emerged. The commitment to protect, the refusal to look away, and the determination to hold all perpetrators of violence accountable remain the bedrock of a just society. The Niueule case has become an integral part of the territory's cultural and legal consciousness, a point of reference that keeps the community grounded in the realities of the struggle against domestic violence. It is a memory that demands that we never settle for the status quo, that we continue to challenge the norms that perpetuate harm, and that we keep the welfare of the most vulnerable at the center of our communal mission. The legacy of those who were lost is a legacy of light, a light that has illuminated the dark corners of the domestic sphere and motivated a whole society to commit itself to the relentless pursuit of safety, justice, and the sanctity of life. This is the promise that the community has made, a promise that is renewed with each passing year, and a promise that stands as a lasting, solemn testament to the lives that were so cruelly taken but are now forever enshrined in the vigilant, compassionate, and protective heart of the people of American Samoa. The final resolution of the legal process is merely a chapter in this larger story, a story that will continue to unfold as long as there is a community dedicated to the protection of the innocent, the pursuit of truth, and the absolute, unwavering commitment to the safety of every home, ensuring that the memory of the past serves as the foundation for a future where every individual can live with the assurance that they are protected, valued, and never alone in the face of danger. The conclusion of the legal saga and the subsequent period of community reflection have solidified the Niueule tragedy as a defining, albeit deeply painful, milestone in the modern history of American Samoa. As time passes, the intensity of the initial shock may recede, but the structural and cultural changes it initiated have become deeply embedded in the territory's infrastructure. The story of that December day is no longer just a narrative of crime and punishment. It has evolved into a foundational cautionary tale, an essential component of the island's collective memory that informs how current and future generations perceive the obligations of communal life. This evolution highlights the profound capacity for a society to absorb the impact of an unthinkable evil and translate it into a lasting, protective barrier. The transformation is visible in the everyday interactions of the people, where there is a newfound, palpable sensitivity to the well-being of others and a willingness to break the traditional barriers of silence that once allowed such tragedies to fester. This internal shift is the most enduring, albeit invisible, monument to the victims. The ongoing efforts to maintain this vigilance are evident in the sustained commitment to the legal and social reforms that were birthed from the crisis. The legislative framework, which was so quickly and decisively overhauled in the immediate wake of the trial, continues to be refined, ensuring that it remains responsive to the complexities of modern domestic life. These laws act as a constant, firm reminder that the state has an absolute duty to protect those who are most vulnerable, and that the domestic sphere is not a sovereign realm exempt from the standards of safety and human rights. This development has provided a vital sense of security for the women and children of the territory, knowing that the mechanisms of justice and protection are now more robust, more accessible, and more deeply ingrained in the public consciousness. It is a transformation that has redefined the role of the community in ensuring the safety of its members, shifting the focus from passive observation to proactive, responsible guardianship. As we look toward the future, the narrative of the Newell case serves as an unwavering moral anchor. It reminds us that the struggle against domestic violence is not a task with a definitive end date, but a perpetual commitment to the sanctity of life. The territory has accepted this responsibility with a gravity that honors the victims and ensures that their lives, while cruelly cut short, continue to hold immense meaning. The story is now part of the educational fabric of the island, helping to socialize a new generation to value equality, respect, and the fundamental right to live without the fear of internal threats. This educational effort is crucial for dismantling the lingering, archaic perceptions that have historically contributed to the persistence of abuse, replacing them with a modern, compassionate understanding of interpersonal relationships. The legacy of the victims is thus perpetuated not through mourning, but through the deliberate, daily cultivation of a society that is fundamentally intolerant of violence. The broader implications of this case extend to the global discourse on domestic homicide, offering a stark, illustrative example of how toxic jealousy, when fused with extreme substance abuse and isolated in a controlled environment, can lead to the most catastrophic of outcomes. The forensic detail of the locked door, the victim's desperate attempt to shield her child, and the perpetrator's subsequent callousness provide a chilling, precise blueprint of the mechanics of such crimes. By documenting these details so thoroughly, American Samoa has contributed a valuable, if deeply unsettling, contribution to the understanding of how to prevent such escalations. This knowledge serves as a tool for researchers, advocates, and policymakers around the world who are fighting similar battles in their own communities. The Newell tragedy is thus transformed from a localized horror into a broader, international lesson on the importance of early intervention and the lethal nature of untreated domestic toxicity. In the quiet, daily life of the islands, the memory of that December remains as a silent, guiding force. It is present in the way neighbors acknowledge one another, the way community leaders prioritize the needs of families, and the way the entire territory stands together in its commitment to never again allow such a darkness to descend. The victim and her unborn child, though long gone, have effectively become the conscience of the island, their memory prompting a constant, quiet vigilance that keeps the territory safer than it ever was before. This is a profound, beautiful, and necessary redemption, an attempt to balance the scales of justice by fostering a future that is defined by protection rather than violence. It is an acknowledgement that while we cannot change the past, we have the power to define our response to it, and that the highest tribute we can pay to the fallen is the construction of a world where their suffering is never repeated. The final pages of this extended reflection bring us to a place of somber acceptance and renewed resolve. The pain of the loss is a permanent fixture of the community's life, but it has been softened by the purpose that has emerged from it. The territory has not merely survived this tragedy, it has grown through it, becoming more united, more aware, and more committed to the ideals of justice and mercy. The legal process may have concluded, the trial may have ended, and the perpetrator may be serving his sentence, but the real work, the work of protecting the vulnerable, empowering the marginalized, and maintaining the sanctity of the home, goes on. It is a work that belongs to every citizen, every neighbor, and every leader, a collective mission that ensures the memory of the victims is kept alive not through the rehashing of their final moments, but through the enduring, vibrant, and protective spirit of the society they left behind. This is the ultimate victory, a victory of light over shadow, of community over isolation, and of life over the cruel, senseless hand of violence. As we conclude this examination of one of the most haunting cases in the territory's history, we are left with a renewed sense of the fragility and the immense, irreplaceable value of human life. The story of Newell will continue to be told, serving as a permanent fixture in the cultural memory of American Samoa, but it will always be told alongside the story of how the community rose to meet the challenge of that darkness. It is a narrative of profound transformation, of the power of a unified people to insist on justice, and of the resilience of the human heart when it is motivated by love and the protection of the innocent. The future that lies ahead for the territory is one that has been hard-won through the fire of this tragedy, a future that is, and must always be, a testament to the lives that were lost and the enduring spirit of those who remain to honor them. May the silence of the village, once so terrifying and heavy with hidden horror, now be a silence of peace, safety, and deep, communal belonging, a sanctuary restored, protected by the vigilant, unwavering love of a people who have learned, at the highest possible cost, the true, absolute necessity of looking after one another. This is the promise that holds the society together, the thread that runs through the history of the territory, and the enduring, final commitment to a life where every home is safe, every voice is heard, and the tragedy of Newell is never, ever allowed to be forgotten or repeated, standing as an eternal sentinel against the darkness that once tested the soul of the islands, and as a beacon of the unwavering, collective will to protect the sanctity of life against all odds, for all time. The finality of the tragedy in Newell, while anchored in the brutal events of that December day in 2021, continues to exert a profound and transformative influence on the collective psyche of American Samoa. As we reach the conclusion of this extensive reflection, it is imperative to acknowledge that the story does not end with the sentencing of the perpetrator or the enactment of new statutes. Instead, the story has integrated itself into the historical and moral narrative of the territory, serving as a permanent, vigilant guardian of the values that the community now holds most dear. The evolution of the island from a place of quiet, often unspoken domestic suffering to a community that openly prioritizes the safety and sanctity of every individual is the true, living legacy of the victims. This progress represents a fundamental shift in the social contract, one that acknowledges the interconnectedness of all citizens and the shared responsibility to protect the most vulnerable from the reach of private violence. The memory of the mother and her child has become a lens through which the community views its current progress, a standard of measurement for its ongoing commitment to justice, and a source of motivation for the continued protection of the innocent. This transformation is perhaps most evident in the heightened level of communal awareness that now permeates daily life in the villages. The cultural tendency to prioritize family privacy, which once allowed the walls of the home to conceal the escalating brutality of the perpetrator, has been replaced by a more nuanced and responsible approach to family dynamics. There is now a widely understood, though rarely articulated, agreement that the health of the individual is the foundation of the health of the society. This understanding is reflected in the active, everyday vigilance of neighbors who have learned that the simple act of checking in, of offering a listening ear, or of recognizing the early, subtle warning signs of controlling behavior can be the difference between life and death. The shift is not a rejection of family, but an expansion of the definition of family to include the entire community, creating a safety net that is designed to catch those who are at risk of falling into the abyss of domestic despair. This is a profound, communal act of healing that honors the victims by ensuring their absence is felt as a motivation for greater presence and protection. The legislative and judicial advancements in Pago Pago serve as the formal structure upon which this cultural change rests. By codifying the protections for women and children and ensuring that the consequences for domestic violence are severe, transparent, and unwavering, the government has provided the necessary framework to support the community's evolving values. These laws are not just ink on paper. They are a declaration of the territory's identity, an assertion that the brutal violation of a home is a violation of the entire community and will be met with the full, unyielding force of the law. The rigorous application of these statutes, the ongoing training of law enforcement, and the dedication to the victims' rights are all testaments to the fact that the territory has learned the most difficult of lessons. It has taken the raw, agonizing experience of the Newell murder and distilled it into a rigorous, proactive approach to public safety, ensuring that the legal system is a powerful tool for the protection of life, rather than just an observer of its destruction. As we look toward the future, the narrative of this case serves as an eternal imperative for continued vigilance. The world is an ever-changing landscape, and the challenges of domestic violence are as complex and shifting as the society itself. The memory of the victims compels the community to remain awake, to remain engaged, and to remain critical of any patterns that might again allow such horrors to flourish in the shadows. This is a perpetual commitment, a promise made by every generation to the one that follows, to uphold the dignity and the safety of every human life. The story of that December day will remain a part of the territory's history, a somber landmark that guides the collective conscience and serves as a reminder of what happens when a society allows the dark, possessive, and violent impulses of the individual to go unchecked. It is a story that has been fully documented, fully processed, and fully condemned, ensuring that it stands as an unshakable monument to the necessity of a community that values its people above all else. In this deep, final reflection, we must also recognize the profound human cost of the tragedy, a cost that is not erased by policy change or legal justice. The loss of a mother and her unborn child is a hole in the fabric of the community that can never be mended, a silent space where laughter, growth, and the future should have been. The grief of the survivors is a quiet, enduring presence, a testament to the fact that while justice provides a measure of closure, it cannot provide comfort. This reality is the heart of the community's commitment. It is the reason that the changes are so deep, the vigilance so constant, and the resolve so unshakable. The community recognizes that while they cannot bring the victims back, they can ensure that the spirit of their existence, the sanctity of their lives, and the injustice of their deaths continue to inform a future where such things are no longer possible. It is a sacred, communal duty, a way of living that honors the victims every single day through the practice of care, protection, and uncompromising respect for the value of every individual. The story of the Newell tragedy is thus transformed from a narrative of darkness into a narrative of light, a story about the strength of a people who decided that they would not be defined by the violence of one man, but by the compassion and the protective unity of the whole. It is a story that has traveled from the locked, suffocating silence of a single house into the open, vibrant, and conscious life of an entire territory. It is a journey from trauma to transformation, from victimhood to agency, and from silence to a loud, resolute commitment to the truth. The memory of the mother and her baby now rests in the heart of the community, safe, honored, and forever acting as a sentinel of peace. The islands of American Samoa, with their lush mountains and deep, encircling waters, remain a place of beauty and connection, a place where the people now live with a deeper, more profound understanding of what it means to be a neighbor, a family, and a society that truly, unequivocally cherishes the life of every person within its borders. Finally, we acknowledge that the true, lasting victory is not found in the resolution of the case, but in the sustained, daily life of the community that has learned to protect its own with such ferocious and tender love. The legacy is in the safety of every child that is brought into the world, in the peace of every home that is free from the threat of violence, and in the collective, unwavering belief that every life is of infinite, irreplaceable value. This is the truth that has emerged from the darkness of the locked room, a truth that now lights the way for the future of the territory. The story ends here, but the values it has instilled remain, a living, breathing force that continues to guide the islands toward a future that is, and must always be, a sanctuary of peace, dignity, and life. The memory of the Newali victims will forever stand as the guiding light of this journey, a solemn and eternal reminder that the sanctity of home and the protection of the vulnerable are the highest, most vital responsibilities of a civilized society, a responsibility that is embraced, upheld, and cherished by every soul in the islands, ensuring that the light of this commitment will never fade, never falter, and never be extinguished, even in the face of the darkest, most challenging of times, remaining as a testament to the power of a community that has chosen, above all else, to stand together in the name of life, honor, and the enduring, sacred memory of those who are lost, now protected by the eternal, communal love of a society that has finally and forever found its voice in the defense of the most precious of all things, the life of another. The final resonance of the Newali tragedy, as we extend our contemplation beyond the immediate aftermath and the initial legislative reforms, lies in the permanent alteration of the territory's social conscience. It is a quiet, profound change that manifests not in grand gestures, but in the subtle, daily rhythms of communal life. The memory of the mother and her child has become a silent, ever-present witness to the territory's journey toward a more protective and transparent society. In the years following that December in 2021, the community has matured in its understanding of what it means to truly inhabit a space of safety. It has moved beyond the mere enactment of laws to the cultivation of a culture where the sanctity of the home is not a theoretical concept, but an active, shared commitment. The horror of the locked room, with all its chilling implications of isolated control and unchecked violence, remains a dark anchor point, a reference that keeps the community grounded in the reality of what can happen when vigilance falters. This collective memory has effectively stripped away the old, protective coatings of silence that once allowed domestic discord to spiral into murder, replacing them with a new, necessary standard of radical transparency and communal accountability. The way the territory now approaches the welfare of its most vulnerable members is a testament to this transformation. There is a pervasive, heightened sensitivity to the lives of women, particularly those navigating the complexities of pregnancy or the vulnerabilities of domestic life. This is not merely a government-mandated priority. It is a grassroots, neighbor-to-neighbor imperative. The tragedy has fostered a society that is deeply skeptical of isolation and profoundly appreciative of the necessity of presence. Neighbors have learned that their connection to one another is their strongest shield against the kind of darkness that took root in Newali. This sense of shared destiny, of being woven into the same tapestry of life, is the most powerful deterrent against the domestic abuse that once thrived in the secrecy of the private sphere. The legacy of the victims is therefore perpetuated in the everyday actions of a society that has decided, with absolute finality, that no one should ever again be forced to suffer in the dark or plead for mercy in a locked room without the intervention of their community. The institutionalization of these values through continuous legal and social refinement ensures that the progress made is not ephemeral. The authorities in Pago Pago have maintained a rigorous, ongoing commitment to the policies birthed from the tragedy, regularly evaluating their effectiveness and adapting to the evolving nature of domestic challenges. This institutional persistence is vital. It demonstrates that the territory has internalized the lesson that protection is not a completed task, but a continuous obligation. The training of first responders, the dedication of social workers, and the active involvement of community leaders in support programs all point to a system that is no longer content to react to disaster but is instead driven to proactively identify and mitigate risk. This shift from reaction to prevention is the hallmark of a mature society, and it is a direct outgrowth of the sobering reality faced in the wake of the Newell murder. Philosophically, the case forces a perpetual interrogation of our definitions of trust and sanctuary. How do we trust in our homes, and how do we ensure those sanctuaries remain true to their purpose? The answer, as explored through the history of this tragedy, is through the integration of the private into the communal consciousness. We are responsible for one another. The tragedy of the locked room is a lesson in the dangers of absolute boundaries. When a home is sealed off from the rest of the world, it loses its moral compass and its link to the humanity of the surrounding community. By opening the doors of communication, by insisting on the visibility of well-being, and by refusing to let the mask of domestic normalcy conceal the reality of suffering, the people of American Samoa have redefined the parameters of their social order. They have built a society that recognizes that the most vital infrastructure of their territory is the safety and dignity of the individuals who inhabit their homes. As the memory of the victims continues to inform the present, it also shapes the aspirations for the future. The territory is building a legacy where the protection of the innocent is the primary metric of its success. This is a vision that transcends the boundaries of the island, offering a model of how a community can rise from the depths of a horrific event to claim a higher ground of ethical behavior. The tragedy has not left the islands bitter or broken, it has left them stronger, more united, and more acutely aware of the fragility and the immense value of every life. This awareness is a quiet, powerful force that keeps the islands grounded and ensures that the dark impulses which fueled the perpetrator's rage are recognized, marginalized, and resisted at every turn. The territory has effectively immunized itself against the recurrence of such a disaster by embracing a culture of radical, protective love. In the final, enduring reflection on this case, we see the absolute victory of the human spirit over the forces of destruction. The murderer attempted to erase the life of his wife and child, to lock away their existence and leave only silence, but he failed. He failed because he could not control the legacy of his victims. He could not prevent their story from becoming the catalyst for a societal shift that has ultimately saved countless other lives. The victims are not just memories. They are the architects of a safer future. Their lives have been multiplied in the protective actions of a whole community. This is the ultimate redemption of a tragedy that once seemed purely destructive. It is a victory that is marked not by a celebration, but by the steady, persistent hum of a community that is awake, watching, and acting to ensure that the light of the innocent is never again obscured by the darkness of the violent. We conclude this reflection with an acknowledgement of the profound, sobering truth of our existence, that the capacity for both great love and unimaginable harm resides within the human heart. The Newell tragedy is a permanent, haunting reminder of this duality, but it is also a reminder of our power to choose. The people of American Samoa have made their choice. They have chosen to build a society that protects, that notices, that cares, and that refuses to let the isolation of the individual lead to their destruction. This is the promise they have made to the memory of the victims, and it is the promise they keep every single day through their actions. The story of the mother and her unborn child is now the heartbeat of this commitment, a rhythm that pulses through the life of the territory, ensuring that their names are not just remembered, but that their value is reflected in the safety of every home and the peace of every street. This is the ultimate, final, and most profound honor that a community can bestow upon the fallen, and it is the only possible end to the tragic tale of Newell, a tale that transformed the islands into a sanctuary for all, a place where the darkness has been driven away by the unified, unwavering, and eternal light of a people who have learned that the protection of the innocent is the highest calling of the human soul, a calling they fulfill with every breath, every action, and every decision. To stand for the value of the life that is and must always remain sacred, protected, and cherished above all else, forevermore in the protective, communal heart of American Samoa.